Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped off the transport helicopter onto the dusty tarmac of forward operating Base Thunder, her boots hitting the ground with the same confidence she'd carried through 3 years of exemplary flight training. The desert heat hit her like a wall, but she kept her shoulders squared and her expression calm as she surveyed her new home for the next 18 months. The base stretched across the horizon like a small city made of canvas and steel, with the distinctive silhouettes of Apache helicopters lined up like sleeping predators against the orange sky. Sarah had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old, watching airshows with her father and knowing with absolute certainty that she belonged in the cockpit of one of those magnificent machines. Her arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. From across the flight line, she could see clusters of pilots and ground crew members pointing in her direction, their conversations too distant to hear but their body language speaking volumes. Sarah had grown accustomed to being the center of attention wherever she went. As one of only 7 women certified to fly the AH-64 Apache, she understood that her presence challenged assumptions that had been carved in stone for generations. Colonel James Harrison, the squadron commander, emerged from the operations building with the purposeful stride of a man who had seen 3 combat deployments and earned every gray hair on his head. His withered face carried the kind of authority that came from making life-and-death decisions in the heat of battle, and his reputation preceded him like a shadow. He was known as a fair leader but one who demanded absolute excellence from every pilot under his command. "Captain Mitchell," he said, extending his hand with a firm grip. "Welcome to the 42nd Attack Squadron. I've read your file. Top of your class at flight school, distinguished service record, and glowing recommendations from your instructors. Impressive credentials." Sarah met his handshake with equal firmness, her green eyes steady and unwavering. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to be here and ready to contribute to the mission." Colonel Harrison studied her for a moment, taking in her confident posture and professional demeanor. He had commanded hundreds of pilots over his 20-year career, and he had learned to read people quickly. What he saw in Sarah Mitchell was neither arrogance nor insecurity, but rather a quiet competence that reminded him of the best pilots he had ever known. "Your quarters are in Building C, 3rd floor," he continued. "Major Rodriguez will show you around and get you oriented. We'll start your integration tomorrow with briefings and simulator time. The real world out here is different from anything you experienced in training, Captain. The enemy doesn't follow the textbook, and mistakes have consequences that go far beyond a poor grade." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Major Carlos Rodriguez appeared beside them. A compact man with intense dark eyes and the kind of mustache that had been perfectly regulation for 15 years, Rodriguez had the reputation of being one of the finest Apache pilots in the Army. His aircraft had never returned from a mission with so much as a scratch, and his tactical knowledge was legendary among the squadron. "Captain Mitchell," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "I'll be your flight lead while you get your bearings. I've heard good things about your flying. Looking forward to seeing what you can do with a real Apache instead of those training birds." Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with nervousness. The training Apaches were functional machines, but they lacked many of the advanced systems and weapons packages that made the combat versions so formidable. Flying a fully equipped AH-64D was like stepping up from a practice piano to a concert grand, every control more responsive, every system more complex, every possibility more dangerous. The tour of the base took 2 hours, with Rodriguez explaining everything from the maintenance schedules to the dining facilities' surprisingly decent coffee. Sarah absorbed every detail, asking pointed questions about operational procedures and safety protocols. She noticed how other personnel reacted to her presence, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism, and a few with outright hostility that they tried to mask behind professional courtesy. "You'll get used to the stairs," Rodriguez said as they walked past a group of mechanics who had stopped their work to watch them pass. "Some of these guys have never seen a female combat pilot up close. Give them time. They'll judge you by your flying, not your gender, once you prove yourself." Sarah nodded, but privately she wondered if that was entirely true. She had faced doubt and skepticism throughout her career, from the moment she first announced her intention to pursue military aviation. Her own father, despite his love and support, had gently suggested she consider becoming a nurse or teacher instead. Her flight instructors had pushed her twice as hard as her male counterparts, claiming they wanted to ensure she could handle the pressure. Even her fellow trainees had sometimes treated her like a curiosity rather than a colleague. But Sarah had learned to channel that skepticism into fuel for her own determination. Every doubting look became motivation to fly better, study harder, and push herself beyond what anyone thought possible. She had graduated first in her class not by accident, but by working 18-hour days and treating every simulator session like a real combat mission. That evening, as Sarah unpacked her belongings in her small but functional quarters, she found herself thinking about the conversation she had overheard while walking to dinner. Two pilots had been discussing the squadron's upcoming evaluation, where senior leadership would observe their training exercises and assess their combat readiness. "I heard they're bringing in General Morrison for the final evaluation," one had said. 3 stars and a reputation for being harder than Chinese arithmetic. "He's the one who decides whether we deploy or stay here playing war games for another 6 months." The mention of General Morrison's name had caused Sarah's stomach to tighten slightly. She knew the general by reputation, an old-school officer who had earned his stars through conventional warfare and had little patience for what he considered social experiments in the military. His public statements about women in combat roles had been carefully neutral, but those who knew him personally understood his real opinions. Sarah placed her framed photograph of her parents on the small desk and stared at it for a moment. Her father's proud smile reminded her of the day she had received her wings, when he had finally admitted that his little girl had chosen the right path after all. Her mother's gentle eyes held the same mixture of pride and worry they had carried since Sarah first announced her career choice. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Rodriguez holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing a more serious expression than he had displayed during their earlier tour. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" he asked. "There are some things about this place that don't make it into the official briefing." Sarah stepped aside to let him enter, grateful for what seemed like an offer of honest guidance. Rodriguez handed her one of the coffee cups and took a seat in the room's single chair, leaving her to sit on the edge of her bed. "I'm going to be straight with you, Mitchell," he began. "You're a damn fine pilot. Your records prove that. But this squadron has some personalities that are going to test you in ways that flight school never did. There are guys here who think women belong anywhere except in a cockpit, and they're going to be looking for any excuse to prove their point." Sarah sipped her coffee, which was indeed better than she had expected, and considered his words carefully. "I appreciate the warning, sir. But I didn't come here to make friends or change anyone's mind about gender roles. I came here to fly Apaches and complete the mission." Rodriguez smiled for the first time since entering her room. "That's exactly the right answer. But here's the thing, some of these guys are going to try to set you up to fail, especially with the evaluation coming up. They might give you incomplete information, exclude you from informal briefings, or put you in situations where you're more likely to make mistakes." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in Sarah's mouth. She had hoped that earning her way into this elite squadron would mean the end of having to prove herself over and over again. The realization that she would still be fighting those battles was discouraging, but not surprising. "What would you advise?" she asked. "Be perfect," Rodriguez said simply. "I know that sounds unfair, but that's the reality. You can't afford to make the same mistakes that male pilots might get a pass on. Study twice as hard, fly twice as carefully, and never give them ammunition to use against you." After Rodriguez left, Sarah sat alone with her thoughts and the remainder of her coffee. Outside her window, she could see the flight line where the Apaches sat under their protective covers, waiting for tomorrow's missions. Each of those machines represented the culmination of decades of military aviation technology, from the composite rotor blades that could take direct hits from small arms fire to the sophisticated targeting systems that could track multiple enemies simultaneously. She had memorized every specification, every capability, every limitation of the Apache during her training. She knew that the M230 chain gun could fire 625 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy, that the Hellfire missiles could destroy armored vehicles at ranges exceeding 5 miles, and that the helicopter's advanced sensors could detect enemy movement in complete darkness. But technical knowledge was only part of what made a great combat pilot. The other part was something that couldn't be taught in classrooms or practiced in simulators. It was the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure, to maintain composure when everything around you was chaos, and to trust your instincts when technology failed or enemies behaved unpredictably. Sarah had always believed she possessed those intangible qualities, but she had never been tested in actual combat. Tomorrow would begin the process of proving whether her confidence was justified or simply the product of an untested ego. She pulled out her flight manual and began reviewing the pre-flight procedures she had already memorized. Every switch, every gauge, every warning light had to become second nature. In combat, there would be no time to think about basic procedures, they had to be automatic responses that left her conscious mind free to focus on tactics and threats. As the night wore on, Sarah could hear the sounds of the base settling into its evening routine. Generators hummed in the distance, providing power to the essential systems that never slept. Guards walked their posts with measured steps, their boots crunching softly on gravel paths. Somewhere across the flight line, a maintenance crew worked under floodlights to repair a helicopter that had returned from patrol with minor damage. This was her world now, she realized. A world where every decision mattered, where mistakes could cost lives, and where she would be judged not just on her performance but on whether her presence validated or undermined decades of military tradition. It was exactly what she had wanted, even if it came with challenges she had never fully anticipated. Sarah finally closed her manual and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring her first real test as an Apache pilot. She had spent years preparing for this moment, but preparation was different from execution. Tomorrow, she would begin to discover whether all those hours of study and practice had truly prepared her for the reality of military aviation. Outside her window, the desert night was surprisingly cool, with stars visible in a way that city dwellers rarely experienced. Sarah found herself thinking about all the pilots who had looked up at those same stars, from the early aviators who had first dreamed of powered flight to the modern warriors who pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the air. She was part of that tradition now, whether some people wanted to accept it or not. Tomorrow, she would begin writing her own chapter in the ongoing story of military aviation, one flight at a time. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 0500 hours, but Sarah Mitchell was already awake. She had been lying in her narrow bunk for the past 30 minutes, mentally rehearsing the day's flight procedures while listening to the familiar sounds of a military base coming to life. The distant rumble of diesel generators, the rhythmic footsteps of early morning patrols, and the occasional bark of orders from across the compound created a soundtrack that had become oddly comforting. Sarah dressed quickly in her flight suit, the desert camouflage pattern still crisp from the base laundry. Every pocket had been organized with military precision the night before: survival radio in the left breast pocket, tactical pen in the right sleeve, emergency medical kit secured to her belt. She had learned early in her career that preparation eliminated hesitation, and hesitation in aviation could be fatal. The dining facility was already bustling with activity when she arrived. Pilots, ground crews, and support personnel moved through the serving lines with the efficient choreography of people who had performed this routine countless times. Sarah grabbed a tray and selected her breakfast carefully: scrambled eggs for protein, whole wheat toast for sustained energy, and black coffee that looked strong enough to dissolve metal. She found an empty table near the window and was halfway through her meal when Major Rodriguez appeared with his own breakfast tray. His dark eyes carried the alertness of a man who had trained himself to be fully operational within minutes of waking. "Ready for your first real Apache?" Rodriguez asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I pulled some strings and got us assigned to Dragon 77. She's one of our best birds, all systems upgraded, weapons package optimized, and a maintenance record that would make any pilot jealous." Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly at the mention of the aircraft designation. Dragon 77 was legendary within the squadron for its reliability and performance. Previous pilots had used it to complete some of the most challenging missions in the squadron's history, and its nose art, a fierce dragon-breathing digital fire, had become an unofficial symbol of excellence. "I appreciate that, sir," Sarah replied. "I've studied the aircraft specifications, but I'm curious about any quirks or characteristics that don't make it into the technical manuals." Rodriguez smiled, recognizing the question of a pilot who understood that every aircraft had its own personality. "She pulls slightly left during hover, but corrects beautifully once you're in forward flight. The targeting system is calibrated perfectly, but the display brightness needs to be adjusted manually in bright sunlight. And the collective has just a touch of play in it, not enough to affect performance, but enough that you'll notice it if you're not expecting it. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, both mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. Around them, other pilots discussed mission assignments, weather conditions, and the latest intelligence reports from the field. Sarah listened to these conversations with half an ear, absorbing the casual professionalism that marked experienced combat aviators. The flight line was a hive of activity when they arrived. Ground crews moved among the helicopters like worker bees, performing pre-flight inspections, loading ammunition, and conducting the hundreds of small tasks that kept military aircraft operational. The morning air was crisp and clean, with just enough wind to make the aircraft covers flutter gently. Dragon 77 sat in her designated spot like a mechanical predator waiting to be unleashed. The AH-64D Apache was an imposing machine even when motionless, 35 feet long, 48 feet wide at the rotor tips, and bristling with enough firepower to level a city block. The tandem cockpit configuration put the pilot's position above and behind the co-pilot gunner, providing excellent visibility in all directions. Sarah began her walk-around inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had been drilled into her during training. She checked the condition of the composite rotor blades, looking for any signs of damage or wear. She inspected the landing gear for proper extension and tire pressure. She verified that all access panels were secure and that no fluids were leaking from hydraulic systems. The weapons inspection required special attention. The M230 30mm automatic cannon hung beneath the aircraft's nose like the thong of some mechanical beast, its ammunition feed system connecting to bins that held up to 1,200 rounds. The stub wings carried pylons for Hellfire missiles, each one capable of destroying an armored vehicle at ranges that seemed almost magical to anyone who had grown up with earlier generations of military technology. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Rodriguez said, joining Sarah as she completed her inspection. "Ugly as sin by civilian standards, but absolutely gorgeous if you understand what she can do." Sarah nodded, running her hand along the fuselage with something approaching reverence. This wasn't just a machine, it was the culmination of decades of engineering evolution, designed by people who understood that pilot and aircraft had to function as a single entity. Every line, every angle, every component had been optimized for the deadly ballet of aerial combat. The pre-flight briefing took place in a small room adjacent to the Flight Operations Center. Weather conditions were favorable, clear skies, light winds, and excellent visibility extending to the horizon. Their assigned training area was a designated zone 15 miles east of the base, where they could practice advanced maneuvers without interfering with other operations. "Today we're going to focus on basic flight characteristics and weapons systems familiarization," Rodriguez explained, pointing to a detailed map of the training area. "Nothing too aggressive on your first flight, but I want to see how you handle the transition from training aircraft to a fully configured combat machine." Sarah studied the map carefully, noting terrain features, emergency landing sites, and restricted airspace boundaries. The training area offered a variety of challenges: open desert for high-speed flight, rocky hills for low-level navigation, and designated targets for weapons practice. It was an ideal environment for a pilot to push boundaries while maintaining appropriate safety margins. The walk to the aircraft felt like a pilgrimage to Sarah. This was the moment she had been working toward for years, her first flight in a combat-configured Apache as a squadron pilot. Every step carried the weight of expectations, both her own and those of the people watching her progress. Climbing into the pilot's seat required a practice series of movements to avoid bumping switches or damaging equipment. The cockpit was cramped by civilian standards but felt perfectly proportioned to Sarah, who had spent hundreds of hours in similar configurations. Every control fell naturally to hand, every display was positioned for optimal visibility, and every system seemed to invite interaction. The startup procedure was a carefully choreographed sequence that had to be completed in the proper order. Sarah went through each step methodically, her hands moving automatically to switches and controls while her mind remained focused on the subtle sounds and vibrations that indicated proper system operation. The twin turboshaft engines wound up with a distinctive whine that gradually deepened into a powerful rumble. Dragon 77 ready for departure, Rodriguez announced over the radio, his voice carrying the calm professionalism of a pilot who had performed this routine hundreds of times.
Dragon 77, cleared for departure to Training Area Bravo.
Maintain 500 feet until clear of base airspace, then, climb to mission altitude. Wind is light and variable, visibility unlimited. Sarah felt the helicopter respond to her controls like a living thing as she lifted off from the landing pad. The Apache's twin engines provided enormous power, and the advanced flight control systems made precise maneuvering almost effortless. She maintained a steady climb rate while scanning her instruments and monitoring radio traffic from other aircraft. The base fell away beneath them as they climbed toward their assigned altitude. From 500 feet, the sprawling complex looked like a miniature city, with buildings, roads, and vehicles arranged in patterns that made perfect sense from above. Sarah could see other helicopters conducting training missions, their distinctive silhouettes moving against the backdrop of endless desert.
How does she feel? Rodriguez asked over the intercom.
Incredible, Sarah replied, her voice carrying undisguised enthusiasm. The power response is amazing, and the flight controls are much more precise than the training birds.
Rodriguez chuckled. Wait until you see what she can really do.
Take us toward the target range and we'll run through some basic gunnery exercises. The flight to the target range took 12 minutes, during which Sarah became increasingly comfortable with the Apache's unique flight characteristics. The helicopter responded to control inputs with immediate precision, but without the oversensitivity that could make aircraft difficult to fly. It was like driving a high-performance sports car that had been perfectly tuned for racing. The target range consisted of several dozen plywood structures arranged to simulate enemy positions. Some were painted to look like armored vehicles, others resembled buildings or bunkers. Electronic scoring systems would record the accuracy of weapons fire and provide immediate feedback on performance.
Let's start with the cannon, Rodriguez suggested.
Select high explosive rounds and engage the target array from 2,000 meters.
Take your time and focus on proper sight picture. Sarah activated the weapons systems and felt a subtle change in the helicopter's behavior as the targeting computer came online.
The head-up display filled with information about range, wind conditions, and target characteristics. She selected the appropriate ammunition type and began her approach to the firing position. The M230 cannon fired with a distinctive chattering sound that resonated through the airframe. 30mm rounds streaked toward the targets at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, each one guided by a fire control system that could compensate for aircraft movement, wind drift, and target motion.
Sarah's first burst scored direct hits on 3 separate targets, sending plywood fragments flying in all directions. Outstanding, Rodriguez commented.
Your sight picture was perfect and you managed recoil compensation beautifully.
Let's try some Hellfire shots.
The Hellfire missile system represented the pinnacle of precision-guided munitions technology. Each missile cost more than most people earned in a year, but it could destroy heavily armored targets with surgical precision from distances that kept the launching aircraft safely out of range of most defensive weapons. Sarah selected one missile and locked onto a target that had been painted to resemble a main battle tank. The missile launch was surprisingly gentle, a brief flash of rocket motor ignition followed by the sight of the weapon streaking away toward its target. The Hellfire's guidance system took over immediately, using laser designation to home in on the exact point where Sarah had aimed her targeting reticle. The explosion, when it came, completely obliterated the target and sent a mushroom cloud of sand and debris high into the air. Perfect shot, Rodriguez said with obvious satisfaction. You're adapting to the systems faster than most pilots I've flown with.
Let's head back to base and debrief.
The return flight gave Sarah time to process the experience of flying a fully equipped Apache for the first time. The helicopter had performed flawlessly, responding to her commands with a precision that made complex maneuvers seem effortless. The weapons systems had exceeded even her high expectations, delivering devastating accuracy with minimal pilot workload. But, more important than the technical performance was the feeling of rightness that had settled over her during the flight. This was where she belonged, in the cockpit of a combat helicopter, pushing the boundaries of what was possible through the marriage of advanced technology and skilled piloting. Every control movement, every tactical decision, every moment of the flight had felt like a natural extension of her own capabilities. The landing back at base was smooth and professional, with Sarah demonstrating the kind of precision that marked experienced pilots. She brought the helicopter to a gentle touchdown on the designated parking spot and began the shutdown procedures with the same methodical care she had used during startup. As they climbed out of the aircraft, Sarah noticed a small group of pilots and ground crew members watching from a distance. Some faces showed curiosity, others displayed professional interest in her performance. But a few carried expressions that seemed less welcoming, as if her presence represented something they would rather not acknowledge. "Don't let them get to you," Rodriguez said quietly, noticing the direction of her gaze. "You flew like a veteran today. Anyone with half a brain could see that you belong here." The post-flight debriefing took place in the Squadron Operations Center, where Rodriguez meticulously reviewed every aspect of their mission. He praised her weapons accuracy, noted her smooth control inputs, and commended her radio discipline. His only criticisms were minor: a slight overshoot on one approach and a tendency to overcorrect during hover operations. "Overall, one of the finest first flights I've observed," he concluded. "You're ready for more advanced training missions. Tomorrow we'll work on tactical formations and emergency procedures." As Sarah filed her flight paperwork, she overheard a conversation taking place near the coffee machine. Two pilots were discussing the upcoming evaluation with General Morrison, and their tone suggested concern about being judged by someone they considered out of touch with modern aviation. "The General's old school," one pilot was saying. "He earned his stars flying conventional missions where everything was black and white. This new world of precision strikes and surgical operations doesn't fit his worldview. And don't get me started on his opinions about women in combat roles," the other pilot replied. "He's never said anything publicly, but everyone knows where he stands. Having Mitchell here during the evaluation is going to complicate things." Sarah pretended not to hear the conversation, but the words stuck with her as she walked back to her quarters. She had hoped that her performance would be judged solely on its merits, without reference to gender or politics. The suggestion that her presence might somehow complicate the squadron's evaluation was both frustrating and worrying. That evening, as she reviewed technical manuals and prepared for the next day's training, Sarah found herself thinking about the path that had led her to this moment. She had always known that being a female pilot would bring extra challenges, but she had believed that exceptional performance would eventually overcome prejudice and doubt. Now, facing the prospect of evaluation by a general who might judge her differently than her male colleagues, Sarah realized that the battle for acceptance was far from over. She would have to be more than good, she would have to be undeniably excellent, performing at a level that left no room for criticism or doubt. The desert night outside her window was peaceful and star-filled, but Sarah's mind was racing with plans and preparations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new tests of her ability to excel under pressure. She had passed her first real test today, but many more lay ahead. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was of Dragon 77 sitting on the flight line, ready for whatever missions the morning might bring. The helicopter had performed perfectly today, responding to her commands with mechanical precision and deadly effectiveness. Tomorrow, she would ask even more of the machine, and of herself. 3 weeks into her deployment, Captain Sarah Mitchell had established herself as one of the squadron's most capable pilots. Her flight scores consistently ranked in the top 10%, her tactical knowledge impressed even veteran aviators, and her calm professionalism under pressure had earned grudging respect from most of her colleagues. But respect, she was learning, was different from acceptance. The squadron briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as pilots filed in for their morning intelligence update. Colonel Harrison stood at the front of the room, his expression more serious than usual as he waited for the last stragglers to find seats. Behind him, a large screen displayed satellite imagery of the surrounding region, marked with various symbols and annotations that told the story of ongoing military operations. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, then caught himself with a slight smile. "Pilots," he corrected, nodding toward Sarah. "We've received new intelligence about increased enemy activity in Sectors 7 and 9. Command believes they may be planning coordinated attacks on supply convoys, which means we need to be ready for rapid response missions." Sarah studied the satellite images carefully, noting the terrain features and potential approach routes that enemy forces might use. The desert landscape offered both advantages and challenges for helicopter operations: excellent visibility and open firing lanes, but also limited cover and predictable flight paths. More importantly, Harrison continued, "I've received confirmation that General Morrison will arrive next Tuesday for our combat readiness evaluation.
This isn't just a routine inspection, our deployment status depends on his assessment of our capabilities." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A negative evaluation could mean extended training, delayed deployment, or even reassignment to less critical missions. For pilots who had trained for years to reach this level of readiness, the thought of being sidelined was devastating. "I want every aircraft spotless, every pilot sharp, and every procedure executed flawlessly," Harrison emphasized. "The general will observe both individual performance and unit cohesion." "Any questions?" Captain Rick Thompson raised his hand. Thompson was a veteran pilot with 8 years of experience and a reputation for asking pointed questions. His relationship with Sarah had been coolly professional, neither hostile nor welcoming. "Sir, will the general be observing all pilots equally, or will there be special emphasis on certain, newer members of the squadron?" Harrison's expression hardened slightly. "Every pilot will be evaluated according to the same standards, Captain Thompson. Performance is performance, regardless of who's behind the controls." But Sarah caught the meaningful glance that Thompson exchanged with several other pilots, and she realized that her presence had become a topic of discussion among certain members of the squadron. The knowledge was both insulting and motivating: insulting because it suggested they viewed her as somehow different, motivating because it gave her additional reason to excel. After the briefing, Sarah headed to the flight line for her scheduled training mission with Major Rodriguez. Today's exercise would focus on coordinated attacks with multiple aircraft, a complex dance of timing, communication, and precision that separated elite units from merely competent ones. The morning air was crisp and clear, with unlimited visibility extending to the distant mountains. "Perfect flying weather," Rodriguez observed as they completed their pre-flight inspection of Dragon 77. The helicopter had become Sarah's regular aircraft, and she had developed an almost personal relationship with the machine. Their mission partner today was Dragon 66, piloted by Captain Mike Patterson and Chief Warrant Officer Dave Chen. Patterson was a solid pilot with a reputation for steady performance, while Chen was considered one of the finest gunners in the squadron. The four of them had flown together several times over the past weeks, developing the kind of tactical chemistry that made complex missions look effortless. "Today we're going to practice coordinated missile strikes," Rodriguez explained as they strapped into their seats. "You and Patterson will approach from different vectors and engage multiple targets simultaneously. Timing has to be perfect. If one aircraft is early or late, the whole mission falls apart." The startup sequence had become routine for Sarah, her hands moving automatically through the checklist while her mind focused on the tactical challenges ahead. The mission would require precise navigation, split-second timing, and flawless communication between aircraft. It was exactly the kind of mission that would showcase pilot skill during the upcoming evaluation. Dragon 77 lifted off smoothly, followed moments later by Dragon 66. The two helicopters formed up in a loose tactical formation and headed toward the training area, flying low enough to use terrain features for concealment. This was advanced tactical flying, using the natural landscape to mask their approach while maintaining the flexibility to engage targets quickly. "Dragon 66, this is 77, Sarah called over the radio. "Recommend we split here and approach from northwest and southeast vectors. Time on target in 4 minutes. 66 copies, Patterson replied. "See you at the party." The two aircraft separated, with Sarah banking left to follow a winding valley that would bring her to the target area from an unexpected direction. Flying at high speed through the narrow valley required constant attention to terrain clearance and wind conditions, but Dragon 77 responded beautifully to every control input. Sarah emerged from the valley exactly on schedule, with the target area spread out before her like a military planning map. Multiple practice targets were positioned to simulate an enemy compound, complete with mock vehicle positions and defensive emplacements. The mission required both aircraft to engage different targets simultaneously,
creating maximum damage while minimizing exposure time.
6-6 in position, Patterson reported. 7-7 ready, Sarah acknowledged. Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark.
Both helicopters fired their missiles in perfect synchronization, the weapons streaking away toward their assigned targets with deadly precision. Sarah watched through her targeting system as her Hellfire missile guided itself to the exact center of the designated target, obliterating the structure in a spectacular explosion. Perfect timing, Rodriguez commented with obvious satisfaction.
That was textbook execution.
The mission continued with increasingly complex scenarios, multiple attack runs, simulated equipment failures, and emergency procedures that tested both individual skill and crew coordination. Sarah found herself performing at a level that surprised even her, as if the combination of advanced aircraft and challenging missions had unlocked capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. But the mood in the squadron began to shift over the following days as word spread about General Morrison's reputation and expectations. Older pilots shared stories about his previous evaluations, describing a commander who demanded perfection and had little tolerance for anything he considered experimental or unproven. Morrison came up through the ranks when women couldn't even serve on combat ships, Captain Thompson explained during an informal gathering in the squadron ready room. He's never commanded female pilots, never seen women in combat roles, and probably wishes things had stayed that way. Sarah, who was reviewing technical manuals at a nearby table, tried to ignore the conversation but found it impossible to block out completely. The discussion wasn't deliberately hostile, but it painted a picture of an evaluation that might be influenced by factors beyond simple pilot performance. "The guy's not evil," added Captain Williams, another veteran pilot. "He's just old school. In his mind, combat aviation is a men's club that's worked fine for 50 years. Why mess with success?" "Because the world changed," Rodriguez interjected, his voice carrying a slight edge. "Combat effectiveness is what matters, not gender. Mitchell flies better than half the pilots in this squadron, and anyone with eyes can see that." The room fell silent for a moment before Thompson spoke again. "I'm not saying she can't fly. I'm saying Morrison might not care how well she flies if he's already made up his mind about women in combat." Sarah closed her manual and stood up, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. For a moment, the silence was complete except for the distant sound of aircraft operations outside. When she spoke, picture this, a packed military briefing room filled with seasoned combat veterans, their chests decorated with medals earned through blood, sweat, and years of service. At the front stands a 3-star general, his voice booming with authority as he addresses the elite Apache helicopter squadron. The air is thick with tension and unspoken doubts. Then, something unprecedented happens. A young pilot rises from her seat, her calm voice cutting through decades of military tradition like a blade through silk. What she says next doesn't just silence the room, it rewrites the rules of aerial combat forever and leaves a decorated general scrambling for words he'll never find. This isn't just another military story. This is the true account of how one woman's extraordinary response to public humiliation became the defining moment that proved courage has no gender, skill recognizes no boundaries, and sometimes the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is simply knowing your worth. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for years to come.